Bill Griffin. Welcome to Different Take Podcast. If you like this content, please subscribe, like, share, comment. Really appreciate you watching. Today, I have with me Russ Skiba. He's a PhD as Professor Emeritus in the School Psychology program at Indiana University and former director of the Equity Project at Indiana University. Has worked with states and school districts across the country, directed numerous grants, and published extensively on school violence, school discipline, and equity in education. He was lead author of the American Psychological Association's Task Force Report on Zero Tolerance and served as project director of the Discipline Disparities Research to Practice Collaborative, a national collaboration of educators, researchers, advocates, and policymakers advancing knowledge and practice to address disciplinary disparities. In the most recent Ed Week poll, he was identified as one of the top 200 scholars in the nation influencing educational policy. Most recently, he co-founded of the University Alliance for Racial Justice, a network of university-based educators dedicated to supporting the struggle against discrimination and disadvantage and in achieving equitable outcomes. His current interests focus on exploring the mechanisms of structural racism and working with those who are seeking to dismantle it. And I really appreciate you doing this, Mr. Skiba. And is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, thanks, Mr. Griffin. That's great.
So a little background on how this interview came about. You co-authored Atlanta Journal-Constitution op-ed piece with Marlon Tillman entitled "Get Tough Approaches Won't Improve School Safety in Gwinnett." And correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but sort of the background for the listener viewers, there's public consensus in Gwinnett County, that's in Georgia, that there's been an uptick in violence this school year. And in August, the school board approved a change in a policy. It's called JCDI, and you can find this on the Gwinnett County Public School website. And one of the components of this policy is that suspensions and or expulsions should be used as a last resort for student misconduct. And so correct me if I got any of that wrong. Is that pretty accurate?
You know, it's really upticks in violence. Am I still coming through okay?
Sure.
Upticks in violence are interesting. You know, I think it's probably an overstatement to say there's been an uptick in violence in general. That kind of general statement really requires data about the entire district. And, you know, when data on student incidents are being collected, those aren't reported till the end of the year. So we don't really have any way of knowing if there's been a general increase in violence. There have been some serious incidents of individual violence that occurred at Gwinnett in the fall. We don't know whether that means that there's a generalized increase in violence. And that's a very important distinction. Back in the period of the late 90s and early 2000s, when zero tolerance was on the rise in schools, those who were advocating for harsh discipline, for an increase in suspensions and expulsions, argued that there was a serious increase in violence going on in our schools, and that we really had no choice but to crack down. As data began coming out, it became apparent that there was no such uptick in violence at the time. There was an increase in youth violence in communities, but there was no similar increase in violence in schools. It's very important that we examine claims about violence and respond to exactly what's happening in the moment and not make assumptions, because those assumptions can sometimes drive us into a state of fear and anxiety that leads us to believe that we have to engage in urgent actions whether or not those actions are going to be effective in the long term. That's been a history in the history of zero tolerance and school discipline. And I think it's something, but please excuse my long answer about that, but I think it's really important to clarify that we have to be data-based in our responses. You know, we're data-based in our academics. We demand that all of our academic instruction be based on best evidence of what works with kids. But sometimes I think when it comes to behavior can be so challenging and induce such anxiety that sometimes we forget to be evidence-based with respect to student behavior.
There seems the reason I say this is because the administration has reported an increase in fighting and drug use and various other things. So that's where that comes from. I don't have that at my fingertips, but that's where I get that from. But let's assume there isn't an uptick for argument's sake. But my first question is, and this is something I'd like to understand, and I think many people like to understand, is what behaviors, student behaviors, are worthy of expulsion or suspension?
I'm gonna shift the focus again here. Let's talk about the history here of the disciplinary policies in Gwinnett County. For quite a number of years, the disciplinary policies in Gwinnett County have been critiqued by parents, community members, advocacy groups as being extremely harsh, as creating disparities, racial disparities in the use of suspension and expulsion. It was a fairly tense situation between those folks and the administration. The community made quite a number of requests for Freedom of Information Act, which usually indicates that there's to have to get the data that way, usually indicates there's a fair amount of tension going on. This summer and fall, new policies were put in place in Gwinnett County that really were responding to the pressure that had been going on for a couple of years. So you have to really give credit to the administration for moving those policies forward. There have been incidents that have occurred, but there have been those kind of incidents that have occurred all across the country. You know, kids have a lot of mental health issues that have emerged in the wake of the pandemic, and it's very clear that those are an issue in schools across the country. There were those within Gwinnett County who said that the increases in disciplinary issues, and in particular, those incidents, were a sign that the new disciplinary policies in Gwinnett County were not working. That's very unlikely to be the case. It's a very unlikely relationship to be able to identify those policies as the cause of change in behavior. New policies put in place around discipline don't have an immediate effect. You put any kind of policy in place like that, it takes weeks, months, perhaps even years to figure out what the exact relationship with the new policy. It's certainly not something that you would see in a matter of days or just a few weeks. So it's that I'll leave it there. Now, to answer your question, I think it's best you can't really pull out one behavior or set of behaviors that would be expelled. We can say we will expel any kid who has an intent to harm others with a firearm, And that's all well and good. We should do that. Absolutely, we ought to do that. But that intent sometimes gets defined differently. There have been districts all around the country, and still are, where a kid brings an elementary school kid brings a plastic weapon to school, or even in some cases draws a picture of a weapon, and that's viewed as threatening by those around him. Kids have been expelled for drawing pictures of guns. Kids have been expelled for pointing their fingers like this at other kids and saying, "I'm going to shoot you." Kids during the pandemic, there were kids who had Nerf guns posted on their wall behind them. And those were seen on a Zoom. Those were reported to the police, and the police came to the door of those kids and threatened the parents because a kid had a Nerf gun posted on their wall. So it's really hard. You know, we absolutely, districts need to have policies in place that define not just expulsion, but a whole range of disciplinary incidents. What consequence does bringing a firearm to school entail? What consequence does a fight entail? What consequence does defiance to a teacher or school personnel entail? And those things get mixed up. You know, sometimes school districts will let a knife go by, and then the next day will push a kid to a long-term suspension because they were defiant to a teacher and a principal and an SRO. You know, while we can say, sure, here are the things that ought to be expelled, and I think we could have pretty good consensus on what those are. In fact, in reality, we need to define very clearly a whole set of relationships between infractions and consequences, and try to make sure that we're using common sense around those.
So
you can even say that all kids, who bring a weapon to school ought to be expelled. But what if this was a kid who was doing skeet shooting the night before, forgot to take this out of their trunk, and that's found? Do we expel that kid? Well, a lot of places have expelled those kids. In fact, that flies in the face of federal policy to do that, because in federal policy, the zero tolerance law says that the superintendent shall use their discretion in terms of context. So when a superintendent or principal says, "I had no choice but to expel that kid for having a rifle that they used for skeet shooting," that's not true.
So what should be done with students that are habitually disrupting class or habitually threatening or acting violently?
Well, you know, again, we want to think in terms of continuums. You know, we need a whole range.
Am I, when I say habitually, sorry to interrupt, but I want to just make sure, when I say habitually disrupting class, for example, does that need a definition?
No, I understand what you're saying about habitually disrupting class, but there are so many ways we can get at the issue. We can approach the issue of a student who is habitually disrupting class. The first thing is that what we know is that if we wait, you know, I did a podcast one time, and this was with the state director of special education and representatives of a teachers professional association, and we were so proud of ourselves for what a great job we'd done in laying out a whole continuum of services and how you need to start early with prevention. and somebody called in and said, well, what do you do if somebody throws a chair? And my first answer immediately was duck. And in retrospect, I think it was a good answer. If you have a serious situation, you do have to deal with it. You have to duck. If there's a serious situation where you have to remove a kid or remove other kids, you take care of it. But the right answer, the bigger answer, is you try and stop the kid throwing the chair or the habitual disruption well before it ever happens. The farther you wait to get into a behavioral sequence, the fewer options you have. Seriously, I mean, if a kid is engaging in violence in your classroom, you have to take care of that violence immediately. You don't have any options. If, however, you start with programs that are evidence-based, that actually show a capability of reducing the probability of disruption and violence in your class, things like positive behavior interventions and support, restorative justice, building relationships with kids. Those things have been shown to reduce the probability of disruption. And if those things are not in place, then we're going to have to face habitual disruption more frequently. Now, those things are no guarantee that we're not going to have disruption. We're still going to have things in place, but we can minimize or decrease the probability of facing those things by a large percentage, by reorienting our approach to school discipline. There was a really interesting study that came out of the University of Virginia by Anne Gregory, and she looked at 80 of the most disruptive kids, or the kids who were suspended for defiance. She looked at the kids the 80 top kids in an entire school district, a large school district, and tracked those kids during an entire day. And what she found was that only 14% of those kids were engaging in disruption in more than 2 locations. So this is high school, so like 6 or 7 different possibilities. What she found was for the rest of them, it was variable. There were certain classrooms in which their behavior fit in quite fine. There were other classrooms in which defiance popped out again and again and again. So this is, when we say a kid who is habitually disrupting a classroom, is this across all teachers? In which case, we probably have a kid who really needs some attention. We need to find a program for that kid and deal with that kid and put something together. If this is a kid who is just rubbing certain teachers the wrong way, then we need to be looking at the relationship between those teachers and that particular kid.
I guess when I use the phrase habitually disrupting class, I'm referring to someone who you've already put the effort in, the student that the effort's already there. There's a certain point where where they have to be removed from the class for the sake of the other people in the class so that they can learn.
Well, it's probably general. There's certainly general truth to what you're saying. We always have to have removal of kids from the class as an option. For the safety of kids, for the safety of the kid themselves, we need to have that as an option. But it is an option that has been dramatically overused in many of our schools, and it's an option that has been consistently overused with Black and Brown students, and it is an issue that is bound up with issues of differences in teacher capability in managing their classroom, and unfortunately, in the case of students of color, even bound up with issues of implicit bias. there is a study that has shown that that levels of overrepresentation of Black and brown kids among teacher referrals for suspension are correlated with levels of implicit bias as measured by the implicit association test, our most reliable measure of implicit bias. So there's no, when we talk about, and again, well, I'll stop there.
Well, you find this even in schools that have very few white students. Is that accurate?
I'm sorry, find what in schools with very few white students?
The implicit bias you're talking about, where there are very few white students and very few white teachers.
Bias is a funny thing. We've all, to answer that question, Bill, I got to go back 400 years.
Well, I'm talking about today.
No, I in order to understand today, we've got to understand. To understand our present, we have to understand our past. And you and I and everyone else in this country lives in a country that started with the enslavement of Africans. And more importantly than that, I mean, sometimes we focus on just enslavement, but more importantly than that, we developed a very, very, very clear belief and system that there were inherent differences that placed a whole group of people from a whole part of the world on a much lower plane, and those things were kept were the law until relatively recently in our history. We talk about Brown versus Board of Education as being the end of segregation. In fact, massive resistance to desegregation put off real desegregation of our schools until 1969, 1970. And very interestingly, that is exactly when the overrepresentation of Black and brown kids in suspension started. And that's been shown through actual studies that wherever desegregation happened, we saw increases in suspension and expulsion and disproportionality in suspension and expulsion. So we have not for us to think that after 400 years of discrimination and oppression, that no traces of that remain in our systems or in our own belief systems is naive. And so some people bristle at the notion that our teachers could be biased. But there's another really interesting study looking at implicit bias. And that study found that teachers are no more biased than the rest of the population. But they also found that teachers are no less biased than the rest of the population. And so at this point in our history, I think when we see disproportionality, and so that brings me around to what we also know about bias. And if we look at schools that have majorities, a high majority of kids of color, no one is immune from issues of bias. Look at what just happened with Tyree Nichols. That was not a white officer that killed Tyree Nichols. That was a group of Black officers. And I think it's a pretty clear demonstration that no one is immune from the stereotypes that we all bring with us.
Okay, so with restorative practices, restorative practices, that is in schools. I interviewed a gentleman, he's retired professor at the University of Georgia, Peter Smagorinsky. You can find him on the channel. And he made the point that there was two problems with what happened with Gwinnett County and in this. he contended that this was not going to work because of the size and scope of the school system, that it should be done on a small level first, and that there should be a great deal of buy-in. So I took that to
Absolutely.
interpret
Absolutely.
that
And
to be that it is somewhat experimental.
Well, no, you know, I wouldn't. I know. Are you saying in general that it's experimental, or should be, or that it ought to be
It is
treated as
perceived,
experiment?
it's perceived as experimental. When you go through I mean, I think I think I understand that you're going to work with, you're going to work with students that you have a problem with. When people hear zero tolerance, they're not necessarily, I mean, that's with certain behaviors. But
Yeah.
I mean, there's
But
never,
Bill,
there's never,
can I
there's
jump
never
in?
just zero. There's not, there's always some sort of level of discretion depending upon what the offense is. But my point is,
Yeah, ought to be, sure.
he contended that it needed to be done on a small scale within that small scale, it should be buy-in. And do you agree with that?
Absolutely on buy-in. We have to make sure that we have teacher buy-in. I think that
Parents
from what I
also.
understand, and I'm not down there, so I can't tell you. I haven't been down there. I haven't read. I've tried to read as much as I can about the implementation of what's going on there, but I'm sure there's things going on there. But what I hear from just about everyone there who looked at this, from advocates and parents, is that, yeah, the rollout was probably not done in the best way possible, that there was not enough training in restorative practices. Any type of new program, one of the most important issues when we're talking about any intervention is treatment fidelity. In other words, is the thing being put in place the way it was intended to be? It'd be like a doctor saying to you, telling you, Bill, the exact way you're going to lose weight, and then you come by next 6 months, a year later, and complain to the doctor, hey, doctor, I haven't lost a pound. Well, did you do what I was asking? Well, not exactly. And it's the same for interventions in schools. In order to be effective, any intervention that we put in place, whether it be a reading intervention or a math intervention or a social skills intervention, we've learned about the ways that those things are effective or not. And there's a fair amount of research on restorative practices, on how you roll those things out, on how you get buy-in from teachers, on how you do training. I don't know anything about the scale that this was done on. I would argue that
It was system-wide.
What's that?
It was system-wide.
Well, so I don't know
180,000.
whether this is. I don't know whether this is there should have been a pilot study, or simply for putting in a system-wide program, there needed to be a lot more commitment to the kinds of funds that would be necessary. Did they hire many places when they do restorative justice or positive behavior supports? They'll have school-based coordinators and hire school-based coordinators to do that. So to a certain extent, I'd agree. I think rather than saying it should have been done on a small scale, I think the effort for making sure that the program gets implemented as planned, that needs to be consonant with the size. So if you're only going to do it, if you're going to do it across the system, then there's certain things you have to do to ensure treatment fidelity. If you're going to do it in just a couple classrooms, then you need to. So yeah.
But the buy-in, you mentioned teachers, but is it necessary to have buy-in from parents?
It's good. Yeah. I think anytime, and especially because well, then I think that it's the responsibility of the leaders of the school district to ensure that there's buy-in. So if, there has been a climate in which many of our leaders have pushed forward the idea that when student behavior is not conforming with our expectations, that we have to crack down. We have to use coercion in order to get them where we want them to be. We have to use increased suspension and expulsion. We have to bring in police. We have to use hardening of the school through security measures. And the trouble is, Bill, that all of that stuff has been there's no evidence to support that any of it improves student behavior or increases the safety of schools. What has been shown to have an effect is developing a school climate through carefully putting in place programs that make clear the expectations of the school through positive behavior supports, that help students return to working with each other and with teachers through restorative practices, that teach kids how to manage their own emotions through social emotional learning, and that emphasize relationship building between teachers and students. Now, the advocates of zero tolerance might say, all of those things sound so soft and mushy, but Bill, you know, we talk about hard data, and the hard data is on the side of those prevention measures. What is soft and mushy is ignoring the hard data and continuing to believe that we can somehow make our schools just the way we want them to be through coercion.
So are they or not schools? Are they in history, not just today, but where schools, public or private, did not? And maybe we need to define, maybe you give us a brief example of what a restorative practice is, but let me just ask this question first, if you don't mind answering.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I
go back before you do that? Before you do that, can I get back? You have to excuse me as an academic. I do go on sometimes, and I don't think I answered your question about parents. I think our entire national dialogue about student discipline has been influenced by the belief that we need to crack down on students. And I think parents hear that same discourse and are sometimes convinced, you know, as a parent, if I hear of an incident happening in my schools, I want action to be taken right now to keep my kids safe. And it's up to those who are in leadership positions to say, we're with you, you know, absolutely, we got to keep the school safe. But I got to tell you that suspending more kids and expelling more kids and putting in more police is not going to do it. You know, that's the truth. That's the evidence. So let's work together. And here's the things we're going to be using. And so, yeah, I think it's very common. You know, when parents hear of when any of us as a parent hears about issues about student behavior, it's natural to say, do something. And it really is, it's up to the leaders to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. And we have looked around, and this is what is most likely to have an impact on that for us.
Are there schools that exist today or in history that did not, that practiced what I will call traditional disciplinary policies? They demanded a very high level of discipline, and they also have a high level of academic achievement. Is that not true?
I don't know. I don't know.
In other words, do you have to? Do you have
a database on that, Bill? Or
no, I'm asking the question.
I don't think there is a database. I think what
I'm asking the question if that's true.
You know, what we have is a current database about what works currently. And the history of discipline is so interesting. I mean, suspension and expulsion actually didn't start getting used much until the 60s or 70s. Up until that point, the main up well into the 60s, the main punishment for kids was corporal punishment. And we, at a certain point around that time, from the 40s through the 60s, started to come to a consensus that hitting our kids might not be the best way to go. And suspension and expulsion, we didn't really know what else to do. And so putting kids out of school became the what else to do. And over time, we found out, well, that's not really so good either, because when you put kids out of school, you might have a kid who is choosing to act out, or is turning around at his desk and bothering other kids because he's frustrated with the work that's sitting in front of him. Well, what's going to happen with that kid? Well, he's going to get farther behind while he's out. He might get suspended again, and over time, he's going to decide, hey, this is more fun than being in school, and he's going to meet up with other kids out in the community who are engaging in far worse behaviors than he ever dreamed of. And pretty soon, you're going to have a kid who is going to become totally disengaged. And so we've begun to see those things. Judges certainly see those things. Judges who see kids who are suspended from school, showing them their court, go, what the heck? Why are you putting these kids out of school? So what I think the current data that we have found is there's been a continuum of parenting, from authoritarian to on the other end to kind of laissez-faire. And we know from parenting that neither of those things work. Parents who are strict authoritarians, who just focus on discipline, are going to end up in battles with their kids. Parents who are laissez-faire and let anything go are going to end up with huge problems with their kids as well. Those kids just aren't going to learn how to function in a structured environment. What's worked best for parenting is authoritative discipline. So discipline that sets limits and boundaries, but also says grounds that in relationship. And we're also finding the same thing about schools. The most effective schools are schools that set limits, but also schools that build strong relationships between kids and the staffs. So yeah, I would say there's probably in history, given that that's what we know is most effective, I'd say probably in history as well. My guess is that there are schools that have been very strict, but my guess is that the successful ones have found ways to reach out to kids, to make sure that teachers are, learning about who their kids are, that principals are developing relationships with the kids, that there is an understanding that kids will be kids. And there are some times where we actually say kids will be kids. And there are other times where we say, no, sorry, that's a line that can't be crossed. So yeah.
My experience was that there were very few. My high school, public school experience throughout was I feared my parents far more than the school in terms of my behavior. So I behaved myself. And so for the vast majority of the school, my classmates did too, because they were in the same situation. So was that wrong that they didn't use restorative practices then, or maybe I'm not defining restorative practices correctly? Maybe
they were using restorative practices, Bill.
Pardon me?
And maybe they were using restorative practices. Maybe informally, right. There was informally there was a feeling among teachers that, hey, we need to treat our kids with respect, and we need to work on situations there, and maybe those things just were actually there, but
I think we
you
feared
didn't see them
punishment too.
because the teachers had so I don't know. I don't know. I wasn't there at your school as a fly on the wall, Bill. So
Yeah, I know. So, but what I'm saying is, I think we feared punishment as well. That was part of it. But
but fear of fear of punishment. You know, the person who may have studied punishment
let's put it this way:
the
an
most
incentive to
ever.
avoid punishment. Nobody likes to get
What's
punished.
that?
There's an incentive to avoid punishments. Don't like
Is that what do we want to raise our children to be good because of fear of punishment, or do we wish them to engage in cooperation with their peers and with teachers and authority figures because that's something they've internalized as a better way to be? Which way do we want to which way do we want to teach our kids?
I probably should have started with this. Could you give us a quick example of what a formal restorative practice looks like? Because I mean, a lot
Well,
of people may not know.
I think a good one to look at is peer courts in high schools.
Peer courts.
Peer courts. So what happens with that is instead of just sending kids to the office when there's an infraction or a fight between kids, and this can include pretty serious incidents, the kids are referred to a court of their peers, and their peers are the ones that are making decisions about solutions that can range anywhere from just saying you're sorry to each other all the way up to recommending to the principal, hey, we can't deal with this. You're gonna have to deal with this. We don't have the authority to suspend, but we're gonna have to. And the reaction on the part of kids that go through that is, oh man, I like the old system better because I'm more afraid of my peers on this. And they had some of the peer courts have had very, very good success in resolving things because they're working together. The kids respect their peers, and the whole purpose of any restorative practices is to restore relationships, is to get us back to a point where kids are trying ways to get along. And that, and that's not a magic wand. We don't wave restorative practices over things and fix things. That's a hard process, and it requires education. And so for kids who have been told by their peer court, listen, you guys need to figure out ways to get along, or next time you probably are going to get suspended. They're also saying what the kids need to do to get along, that these are new behaviors that these kids may need to learn, in the same way that when kids fail in academics, we don't throw them out because they failed a test. We said we teach them what they need to do to pass the test next time. That's really the function of school discipline. Bill, the meaning of the word discipline comes from the Greek to teach or learn. It is, we have a sense that discipline means that we are going to apply a consequence. We're also applying discipline when we tell kids, this is not appropriate. You can't do this. What you need to do is learn these other behaviors, and we will do our best to help you learn how to do this differently. That's the essence of discipline.
What other sphere of life, like a university or workplace, where you have a peer court?
Yeah, in the university I just left, and in every university in America.
in the workplace.
You're judged by your peers. All decisions about progress towards tenure, all decisions about tenure, all decisions about promotion are a committee of your peers.
Well, I'm talking about someone
About what?
assaulting another person.
Well, you know, how many, okay, so yeah, let's talk about the university. You know, are there professors who step out of line? I think there's a professor in Indiana, in Indiana. I actually, I don't know what college it was at all, that engaged in sexual harassment and even inappropriate, well, whatever, clearly something that's way outside the pale. How many of those are there? You know, when that happens, obviously it has to be dealt with, but we can't structure entire systems around something that happens. I think that's the first time I've heard of that in 30 years. And it, you know, it's appalling, it's horrifying, and whatever happened to that professor is like, I'm all for it, you know, but we can't structure our entire university system around those extremes. And in the same way, we have done that far too often in our schools, that we are afraid because one or two or a handful of kids are coming from a place where their behavior is just too serious to be handled through common disciplinary practice. But we can't structure our entire disciplinary system around minorities of kids. We need disciplinary systems that work for the entire range of kids.
I don't know how much
And
time.
those will actually, and those things, and those things will help us. You know, I worked with a school as part of a program that was called Safe and Responsive Schools. And what happens is that what happened in that school is they had just suspensions for everything. Kids who didn't bring pencils to their class ended up suspended. I don't know why. They had 13. I don't know if you remember. You probably remember from when you were in school, those kind of molded fiberglass chairs that kind of scooped out, and the kids, you know, if you sat in them, you go, you know. There were 13 of those sitting outside the office of kids waiting to see the principal to be disciplined. And that's how I imagine that some of these kids got suspended for a pencil, because they probably had so much time to get mass anger going that by the time they went in there, they had no interest in working with the principal. Well, we put in place that school put in place a variety of programs. I don't want to go into all of the details, but what happened was that all of those chairs disappeared. And what happened also was they were able to see the kids who really were problematic, the kids that were really tough to deal with, and they were able to focus all of their efforts on those kids. Before, there was so much chaos going on by the overuse of simply relying on consequences that they didn't have enough energy to really focus in on the kids who needed it the most. And so there will always be those serious kids in any school. But if you overextend your use of punishment, then it's going to be more difficult for you to deal with those kids. By getting the whole situation under control with prevention and relationship building, then those kids are going to pop out more, you know, it'll be easier to see those kids popping out and say, okay, here's what we're going to have to do with those kids.
I appreciate you spending all this time with me. I don't know how much more time you have, but I did have one other area I would like to talk to you about.
Sure.
And I appreciate you being generous with your time. But before I do that, I want to ask you just kind of, if you briefly, with traditional discipline policies, I'll put it that way, the vast majority of students in a lot of schools still do okay with that. We're talking about a small, I mean, it depends on the school, where they're located. I'm sure there's some variation. I mean, is there for the vast majority of students, their parents teach them appropriate behaviors. And if you call the parents up and say, hey, we've got a problem, they pretty much solve the problem by just being communicated with on what the student did, correct?
I don't know, Bill. Do you have data on that?
I thought you would.
No, there isn't. I mean, there isn't. That we don't have data.
Okay. Okay.
No, we don't
Let me
have
ask
data
you
on
this.
what percentage of kids are compliant with the rules, and what percentage of kids.
I thought you would
There
know
is
that.
no data on that. And I don't know. Some people say that has changed over time, and that kids are less compliant now than they used to be. And I guess I from the amount of time I've heard that from teachers, number of times I've heard that from teachers, I'd say that's a pretty good data point for me. And I guess I would tend to believe that that's the case. And it's certainly been the case since the pandemic. A lot of kids were really hurt by being off during that time, and kids came back with more difficult problems. But the question is, so things are getting worse. So things in some places are worse than others. So kids are worse since the pandemic. The question is, what are you going to do about that? What are you going to do about that? Are we going to dig in and use the procedures that have been found to be evidence-based that helps us deal with the level of behavior that's there, whether that's because kids are getting worse or because of the pandemic, or we just happen to be in a school that what you're talking about is not the case? Or are we going to use things that have not been shown to be effective, that actually increase a cycle of coercion that's going on, that increase, because when all of us are faced with punishment, there are two things that happen with that: fight or flight. And so the more we rely simply on punishment and coercion to try and get our way and make our schools be what we believe they ought to be, the more we will get fight or flight from our kids. And we have seen over and over again, the data says that stuff just doesn't work. So we've got a tough situation, whether it be because of the school we're in, whether it be because of the pandemic, or whether it's because kids are getting worse. Which do we choose? Do we choose the things that will work, or do we choose coercion that's going to lead to an ever escalating cycle?
See, I saw this recently. This is Baltimore City Public Schools. This is reported in the media, but this comes from the Maryland State Board of Education. So their grade 3 through 8, 7% proficiency in math. In other words, they're not at their level. Only
that's tough.
7% at their level.
Tough.
And
right.
then
That's
further,
tough.
Well, further, they did also, this is from Fox 45 in Baltimore. It says, Project Baltimore combed through the scores at all 150 city schools where the state math test was given. They found in 23 Baltimore city schools, there were 0 students who tested proficient in math. That's, 21 through 22. That's 10 high schools, 8 elementary schools, 3 middle high schools, and 2 elementary middle schools. But I also saw on their website that they're using restorative. They've used restorative practices and have seen positive change. That restorative practices work, and because the city schools is committed, they're going to expand this throughout the whole system over the next 5 years. So this is my question: what's more important, the math scores or implementing the restorative practices? Because I mean, in life, you prioritize things.
They're like this, Bill. They're like this.
That. Okay.
You
don't prioritize.
in the one direction, kids that aren't getting it They're going to look around the class. They're going to bother the girl behind them. They're going to get up and walk around. They're going to tap a kid upside the head and just mention play. They're going to respond, so that's in one direction. In the other direction, when we suspend and expel more kids, those kids are going to lose academic time. If and it's not a one-to-one basis. When a kid is suspended, it's usually for 3 days, 5 days, 10 days. So each incident of suspension, that kid loses 3, 5, 10 days. If you put all that together, all of the suspensions in a given school district, that can result in many, many years of lost academic time. And so these things, figuring out how to put in place effective systems, alternatives to suspension and expulsion, reduce, not eliminate, we're not going to eliminate, but to reduce our suspensions and expulsions and keep kids engaged in learning, that has been shown to actually increase the test scores. Now I don't know the Baltimore data. I don't know whether there's been improvement over time. I don't know how recently they put in place their restorative practices. But
I was reading that they only did this in I think it was a couple schools, and they're planning to implement this over the next 5 years. So
it would not. So you couldn't. I mean, so we really couldn't say that the restorative practices had anything to do with the low test scores. And,
oh no, my question is, in life you generally prioritize things. There's only X amount of resources.
Do you really? I mean,
there's X amount. There's not.
Do you?
Of course you do. There's no such thing as unlimited resources.
Sure, but do you just do work and leave your family alone, or do you just do your family and not do your work? No, I mean, we in our lives we may prioritize at certain points of time, but we have to do both.
Yeah, but
you have to do your family, you've got to do your work, we've got to do academics, we've got to do behavior.
But at a
moment in time, if the behavior is getting out of control, we can prioritize the behavior. If behavior is doing pretty well and the academics look bad, we can prioritize, but that doesn't mean that we don't do both all the time.
You have an hour to spend, and you have a work issue and you have a family issue. You have to pick.
Mm-hmm.
You prioritize that.
Not in general, you don't. Not in general. Not beyond that hour, you don't.
You can't do two things.
I mean, are you telling me you're just going to put all your time into work and ignore your family?
For
your family.
It's the next.
Your poor family, Bill. Think of your family.
I didn't say I was going to pick family. I was going to pick work over family. I said,
I know.
I have only X amount of time in the day. It's finite. I'm going to spend it on one or the other issue. I have to prioritize.
Why not? But why not over time put 50% in each one?
I'm not saying I don't do that over
60,
time. I'm
40,
talking about
or
for
40,
the next
60.
hour. But at any rate, the last question I have for you, if you want to add anything else up, I appreciate it. But I asked this question of another person I interviewed as a parent. And if you have a choice between a school that has a high standard of behavior, no matter what their discipline policies are, but they have a high standard, and there's very few incidents of violence, and it's commonly accepted that it's a safe school to attend. And you have the choice of going to that school, sending your child to that school. If you have that choice, and I'm not talking about a different location, just what the school has, and you have the choice of a school that is kind of violent, But school A, the one that has high standard, there's disproportionality. As a parent, most parents are going to pick school A, aren't they?
Yeah, if you're white.
So if you're Black, you're saying you would pick the school that's.
Yeah, if you're a Black parent and you're looking at the school that is supposedly safe, but Black kids are 3 to 4 times more likely to be suspended from school, 3 to 4 times more likely to be expelled, 3 to 4 times as a result of that more likely to drop out, perhaps even 3 to 4 times more likely to be targeted by school police. Do you feel safe?
I asked
Is
this,
that your will you as a parent feel safe sending your kids to school? And I think you're hitting the nail right on the head there when you talk about that. We need to reach a point in this in our nation where we're talking about safety for all kids. And if we have levels of disproportionality in a school, then this is not safe for all kids. That's not safety. I'm not exactly sure what it is. It's safety for some.
I'm not, make sure I didn't, because I'm certainly not trying to trap you or anything like that. And I hope you don't take it that way, but.
Oh, no.
I want to
I'd
make
be
sure.
engaging in fight or flight if you were trying to trap me, you know?
I want to make sure I ask the question correctly. You have school A that could be disproportional, but there's a very low level of classroom disruption and violence. And then you have school B, which there may or may not be proportionality, but it's and in your case, let's say it's Baltimore, one of these Baltimore City public schools that has high disruption and violence in its.
Yeah.
I thought this was interesting. It's 90% demographic is Black or Hispanic, Latino, 7% white. So some of these schools are probably entirely, I think it's 23 high schools is probably entirely, almost very few white. So would you pick school B or would you pick school A if you're a parent? And
Isn't it awful? Isn't it awful? Isn't it awful that we think?
If you don't mind.
Yeah, isn't it awful? Isn't it awful that we?
I don't think you heard my question. I don't want to trap you or anything.
No. I'm saying what I'm saying though isn't here's my answer. My answer is that I think, isn't it awful that we're placing some parents in that situation? I have to choose between a place where I know my kids are going to be discriminated against, and there is a chance that my kids will not react well to that environment and be harmed by that environment, and sending my kids to a school that's totally out of control. Why are we in a place in our country, as long as we have disproportionality? And this is not uncommon, Bill. This is not uncommon for a school to consider itself to be a safe school, that everything is orderly, and yet that same school will not just have minor disproportionality, it will have very serious disproportionality. This is not uncommon, Bill. There are very few schools in this country that have Black students in them that don't have disproportionality. And so is this the kind of, if we define these things separately, if we say that a school can be safe and yet there is still disproportionality in it, we are making our Black parents choose between between being discriminated against and being exposed to violence. And I don't know about you. I don't think that's a humane choice. And I think it's time that we define safety and discipline in terms of all children. If we have we cannot have safety, we cannot have discipline unless all children feel safe and the discipline is equal between them. And if it's not, we can't say that that's a safe school or a disciplined school.
Okay, you're misunderstanding my question. My question is.
No, I don't think I do. I don't think I do, Bill. I don't think I do misunderstand your question. I'm really trying. You're talking about a school that is primarily safe and primarily has low levels of discipline, and yet there's disproportionality there. I'm not satisfied with that. I don't think we as a society should be satisfied with that. That's not safety. That's safety for some.
Let's assume that the entire population is at one of these schools in Baltimore, and it's almost entirely Black. And you have school A and school B. One's safe and the other one, but it may not be, as you put it, because you said that there could be implicit bias in these schools that cause them to discipline the students more harshly. And then you have school B, which is, I mean, you would admit there are schools that can be too lax with their discipline, don't you think?
There can be schools that can be too lax. And in fact, though, if you look at the data, Bill, the schools that have higher proportions of Black and brown students in them tend not to be more lax. They tend to overuse, they tend to overuse punishments, and so are more likely to get into this coercive cycle of too much punishment is being applied, and kids are resisting that. So this isn't a matter of the white students being, the white schools being more, the predominantly white schools being more strict, and the predominantly Black schools being more lax. In fact, the data suggests it's just the opposite. That you look at school police. School police in predominantly white schools view their roles primarily as mentoring and counseling. School police in urban, higher, more diverse settings view their roles as enforcement. Is that what we want? Is that what we want? And so, the only way we can accept that is to say, well, the kids are worse. Should we be coming into our schools with that perception that a certain type of kids are worse, or should we be coming into this with the perception that all kids deserve compassion, all kids deserve being worked with, all kids deserve prevention? And I think the issue for me is oftentimes, what are we putting into these schools? Where do we stand as far as a system? We know we have high rates of turnover in staff. How can we fix that? We know we have very high mismatch between the staff there, that it's predominantly an all white staff, and we talk for years about fixing that, but we never do. So do we yeah, I'm trying to point. I'm not sure I fully understand your question. I think we're coming at this from two different angles, and the absolute answer is, if I were a parent, if I had to choose between a safe school and a violent school, by God, every parent wants to send their kid to a safe school. So the issue is, how do we work to make our schools safer? That's the issue. How do we work to make our schools safer? And again, are we gonna apply every evidence-based tool that we have at our capability in our command, or are we going to continue a coercion-based model that has not gotten us anywhere?
Well, I could talk about this a really long time, but I think we should probably end it.
All right. All right.
Is there anything else you'd like to add before? And let me start up. And I must disclose this. I am very skeptical of experimenting with this. I'm just speaking my opinion because I think it's important that I disclose this, due to the inordinate amount of time and cost that you're taking away from many students to satisfy a minority. And I understand, I'm not at all saying a kid should be expelled for not bringing a pencil.
Which minority are you talking about, Bill? Bill, which minority are you talking about?
I'm not talking about minority. I didn't say minority.
Yeah, you said to satisfy a minority.
A minority, a small number of students. A small number of students, when many students don't exhibit these behavioral problems. And I'm certainly not saying when I hear zero tolerance, I know that that's most teachers aren't looking to eject hopefully they're not looking to eject students from their class arbitrarily. I would hope not, but all teachers, just like the rest of life, there's bad apples and so forth. But I'm skeptical that of the cost, and I'm really skeptical that it seems to me if you have a school and a private school in a affluent neighborhood that use traditional policies, and then you have these schools in Baltimore that I saw a video of the parents, they were all Black. They were explaining that they were their schools were terrified to go to their kids were terrified to go to school and so forth. And I'm skeptical that they can't have the same thing, that they can't get there.
I think that I agree with you. I think
I'm saying I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of their organization.
Yeah, I think we should all be skeptical. I'd be very skeptical if somebody were to say we can't turn around these schools that are failing with what we know to be evidence-based practices. We have to resort to suspension and expulsion. I'd be very skeptical about that. I think it's interesting when you say you're skeptical about experimenting. I have to disagree with that one though, because our life is an experiment. Anything we do is an experiment. The use of zero tolerance was a 20-year experiment, and it's an experiment that eventually failed. We always, I had one colleague that talked about all teaching as an experiment. Good teachers are experimenters. The bad teachers come in and say, this is the way I'm going to teach. This is the way I have been taught. And, they don't bother to collect data on whether their kids are doing well. They're just doing what they're doing. And some kids succeed and some kids fail. Good teachers say, well, I'm going to try this out, see if it works. And I'm going to do weekly tests. I'm going to do weekly assessments. I don't have to. Nobody makes me do weekly assessments, but I'm going to do this to see how my kids are doing. I'm going to use the data I get from observing my kids every day, and I'm going to modify my practices to make sure as many of my kids succeed as possible. Everything we do is an experiment, and we should be treating them strictly as experiments. We should be doing things and seeing if they change outcomes. Do they change academic outcomes? Do they change behavioral outcomes? And we should be extremely skeptical of anyone who comes in and says, this is the way to do it, and we're just going to do this without collecting data. Absolutely.
I
have to agree with you on that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try things out. In the case of Gwinnett, Georgia, to bring it back around, you can say that the use of restorative practices is an experiment. So the important question is not whether Gwinnett should have turned to restorative practices. It's whether Gwinnett County, in using that experiment, was making sure they implemented this in the right way so that the terms of the experiment are done correctly. You can't go off and do a scientific experiment without having the details correct, to make sure that teachers were trained enough. In other words, and to make sure that data is carefully collected, that we don't just say, oh my God, there's been 2 incidents of violence, we'd better scrap the experiment. That's not a good experiment. That's not a sound experiment. So I'd agree with you that the use of restorative practices in Gwinnett County is experimental. But I would argue that what they should do is to really do that experiment with integrity. To if they're going to put that out there, to say, here's what we're going to do. We are going to train our teachers. Absolutely. We are going to talk to parents. We are going to collect data, and we're going to do this for X amount of time. So please don't tell us it's not working after 3 weeks, because it's not going to work after 3 weeks. But we are going together to do this as an experiment, because we have chosen this based on data, because we have seen this work in other places and we believe it can work here. But we respect you, and we're not going to put it in place without having all of the elements of this experiment in place, so that we can all decide together whether this has been working. And if some of those pieces are missing, I'm just as skeptical as you are.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, and I guess we should probably leave it there. We could probably talk
All
about
right,
this
sounds
another
good.
hour, but thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it, and
Sure.
close with saying thank you for watching Different Take Podcast. Bill Griffin. Please subscribe, like, share, comment if you like the episode. Thanks for watching.